In this episode of the Grow Sanctuary podcast, I interviewed Dr. Michael Corrigan. Michael is a psychologist and tenured associate professor at Marshall University in West Virginia in the United States. His teaching expertise focuses on child development, educational psychology, research methods, and advanced statistical analysis. He has served as the evaluator or primary investigator for more than $19.5 million in federally funded research studies, and his academic work has been published in dozens of peer-reviewed journals and publications. He is the author of several books, including Debunking ADHD, 10 Reasons to Stop Drugging Kids for Acting Like Kids. He's also the co-founder of Multidimensional Education, Inc., that assesses kids within child welfare and schools, and has developed the Vital Child solution to help child welfare better assess and monitor the care of children and families in child welfare systems. And in the episode, we cover a broad range of topics, including Michael's background, his journey to where he is today, what supposed quote-unquote ADHD and quote-unquote ADD actually are, what the drugs that are often prescribed are, and why they're dangerous. We cover the potential negative side effects, including the physical and mental. We talk about the current status in academia surrounding this controversial topic, what parents who want to have a non-drug approach can actually do, and we finish off with a Q&A. So it was a really informative episode for me. I enjoyed interviewing him, and if you're interested in this topic or related topics and you're open-minded, I really think you will enjoy this episode. So with that, I will start the recording. Hello, Mike, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I thought we could start off with briefly your background and how you got into the position that you're in, and someone who's researching the topics that you're researching and the work you're doing, raising awareness for the controversy of, I could say, not sure if that's the best word to describe this diagnosis of ADHD.
Yeah, well, I'm a professor and I teach child development, psychology, research methods, statistics. And for years, I've been doing research for the federal government under grants awarded through the U.S. Department of Ed, Department of Justice, and as well as the National Science Foundation. When ADHD was growing in more popularity here in America, I was aware of it, but not to the extent to what happened. One day, I was in a school. I was doing some research on one of our grants, and I got asked to stay for lunch, and I decided to get in the long line. There was 2 lines on each side of the hallway. It was for fifth graders, I think. And as I got in the long line, I was waiting, talking to the funny kids in front of me. And before I knew it, I realized I was in the medication line. And I was just shocked that day to realize that the vast majority of the kids in there were males, boys, and they were being drugged for ADHD. And it was, I would say, upwards over a third. It was approaching half the 5th grade class of men. And just watched them over lunch and the next period or two just kind of shrink into the humans that they, different humans than they were. They weren't fun anymore. They weren't energetic. They weren't speaking out. And this was when, before the extended release drugs came out. So they would drug them in the morning before they went to school and drug them at lunch to get them through the rest of the day of school. I went home that night. My wife's a wonderful clinical psychologist, and she had a diagnostic statistical manual, the DSM. And I looked up the 18 symptoms for ADHD, and that night I was just angry, and I'd been working on a project for a State Department of Ed at that time to identify gifted children in schools that really hadn't quite blossomed. And I had a list of description symptoms, if you would say, that teachers could use to identify them. And this list basically was identical to what we were using to diagnose ADHD. And at that point, I just started researching more and more, started including a lot of that stuff in my talks I would give and my workshops I would provide. And one day a teacher and a mother walked up to me and said, I just wish you would write a book on what you just shared with this group, because I had my child diagnosed ADHD and I've drugged him his whole life. And I'm sitting here now thinking I might have done the wrong thing. And I'd published a couple books already, and I called one of my editors, and he said, what's the title of the book? And I said, Debunking ADHD, 10 Reasons Not to Stop Drugging Kids for Acting Like Kids. And he's like, yeah, we can't publish that. So I called my other editor and I told them the title, and they said, we love that. So I was lucky enough to publish it. As to what followed after I published it, the rest of the story we can talk about. But that's how I kind of got into it. It really angered me to see that we were having to drug children to get through a day of school. And I think childhood's pretty valuable. It goes by super fast, and I really don't think we should be giving drugs that basically have the same chemical structure as cocaine and meth to kids to get them through a day.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point there. I like what you said, especially it's interesting about the fact that there's the overlap. I'm not sure if it's 100% or 90% or whatever, but there's a lot of overlap with the symptoms that are the supposed symptoms, the 18, also that they check for ADHD diagnosis, and then the things, the descriptions, the characteristics, properties you were looking at for blossoming/gifted child, whatever you want to call it. One thing I thought would be important to clarify early on is, from your perspective, is there a difference between ADHD and ADD, or can we basically call them the same thing for the purpose of this podcast?
They're basically misused the same way. One is there's 9 symptoms for each. So one is about attention deficit, and the other one is about hyperactivity. So you'll see a lot of adults get the ADD diagnosis because they're no longer necessarily as hyper as they were as a child. But I have a YouTube channel, Debunking ADHD, and there's a video on there, the 7-minute diagnosis, I call it, because that's about what pediatricians are spending, which is the reason I titled that is it's wrong. It should be a diagnosis that takes much longer. We should be looking at, are these symptoms at an intolerable level in both school and home, different settings? We're not doing that. In America here, not all pediatricians, I should clarify, there is a very respectable group. I think it's getting upwards of 40% that refuse to medicate children for basic child development behaviors we see. But yeah, to some degree, the ADD and ADHD, they've kind of combined. I think so many people are labeling themselves that way these days. But for the most part, most kids are going to be diagnosed ADHD and here in America. But for the most part, I think if you watch that video, or if you have the DSM, I mean, basically anybody with a license to diagnose, it doesn't have to be 5 symptoms of the 9. It could be 4, it could be 3, it could be 2, it could be none, and they could still claim that you're ADHD if they feel that you're ADHD, or if a parent convinces them that their child needs to be drugged. So it is, I wouldn't say the worst diagnosis in the DSM, but it's one of the worst. And to clarify, I mean, I'm not a person who thinks that no mental disorders exist. There are plenty of disorders in the DSM that are real and painful and challenging for folks to get through. And I mean, just looking back in life, I lost my mom, shortly. She had cancer when I was in college and lost her shortly after that. And I know what severe depression feels like, especially when you lose the last of your parents at that age. So things are real. But most of those were designed to diagnose adults and not children. And the fact that we're applying these 18 symptoms to children and ignoring basically 40 decades of child development research that shows these are normal patterns of behavior, this maturity, this lack of attention, these boredom, inability to sit still, so on and so on, or wait your turn. These are just things we learn. And the fact that we're diagnosing so many boys at between the ages of 5 to 7 years old here, it is really bad news to me, because I could see if you were 17 years old and you were still bouncing around doing strange things, there might be a reason to look at mental health as a reason. But at 5, 6, 7 years old, for those in development or in education who are familiar with Piaget and his stages of development, I mean, that's a gray area right there where you're moving between stages. And interesting study came out. Several universities did it. I think it was Michigan State and one of the North Carolina universities. But they did a study, they replicated a study and found that it was upwards of 60 to 70% of the children being diagnosed were the youngest boys in their class. So,
wow.
So they weren't really diagnosing ADHD, they were diagnosing age and maturity.
Yeah. There's some good points in there. Like it's quite good, I guess, that, like you said, there's upwards of 40% roughly that are of the pediatricians that are not going along with this quote unquote diagnosis and pushing these drugs, but it's still not enough. And I can definitely also add that if someone's listening to this when this goes live, and you don't have enough time to finish it, then definitely just go to Michael's YouTube channel, Debunking ADHD, and the videos are shorter and he really summarizes these topics. I mean, we're going to go into a lot more detail in this episode, but definitely recommend the channel. So maybe you could go through now, I think, because you said it's like 16 or 18. Let's explain how, I mean, maybe not all of them, but how some of them are, because I think some of them are pretty clearly subjective. They're very subjective, and which is a little bit unscientific. I don't know if that's the main flaw, or what other flaws are there in the way the diagnosis is done.
I think for so many people that have talked to me after my talks or reading my book, so many of them either got diagnosed in school with a little checklist they had available to say, does he move around? Does he lose things? Does he not complete his schoolwork? Is he unorganized? So many of these folks have a checklist. And even in many pediatrician offices where they walk into, they give the parent a checklist to go through and say, does this describe your child? And every single one of those symptoms, to some degree, I would think, maybe there's some mature young ladies at certain younger ages that wouldn't hit every check mark, but to me, I'd say about every young boy, younger than 12, 14 years old, you could probably put a check mark next to each of those. That's how common they are. I still teach this as part of my child development course, and I do talks on this quite often. And I play that video and I ask people to put up their hand for each symptom they have, and once they get to 4, to keep your hand up. So as we do that, at the end of the 7-minute video, I asked them to put their hand back up again if they had their hand up, and I said, please take a look around. And basically everybody in the auditorium has their hand up. And it's a light bulb for many it's confirmation for many more. I think the sad part is that there's always several in the crowd that have been diagnosed ADHD, and they've been told this is what they have and this is who they are, and they look around and it's like, was I diagnosed incorrectly? And is something wrong here? Is this really true? And that's why I wrote the book, Debunking ADHD, 10 Reasons to Stop Drugging Kids for Acting Like Kids, just to paint the whole picture, chapter by chapter, how this came around. It was basically created by the pharmaceutical industry. It did not arise from the medical world. They got a few folks, put it together, and went from there. And there's plenty of research. I have an exchange student in one of my classes this semester from a different country, and she said, "How did you write this book without being arrested?" And I'm like, what do you mean being arrested? And she's like, in my country, you could never say anything like this without being arrested. I'm like, well, in my country, if you have 25, 30 pages of references and they point towards to the fact that, this is all being made up, you're allowed to publish whatever you want. And to that point, I'm just saying it's a fake diagnosis. It shouldn't be in there. And if we are going to use it, let's just use it all on adults, not kids. That if you pick up any child development textbook at any university and you went through and had the diagnosis right next to you, and you looked at each symptom that they used to diagnose ADHD and went back into that child development textbook and looked, you're going to find that symptom is a normal behavior of child development. And to my point, it just seems strange that we're diagnosing 12, 20, some schools, 40% of boys ADHD. And my question is, if a mental disorder is supposed to represent abnormal behavior, at what percentage point is it no longer abnormal? And that's the thing. It's never been abnormal, but somehow we convinced folks to do it. And I think as a parent, which I am, and I have a son who fits all 18 of those symptoms plus 25 more. I've had numerous teachers ask me, have you had him diagnosed? I'm like, no, but here's my card and you can look me up on Google. Don't ask me that question again. But to me, I just think we can't do that to children any longer.
Yeah, totally agree. And yeah, I think, from people like yourself who are not anti, but just, want to look at the problems or help the child in other ways other than the pushing these drugs, there's probably the coaching and other sorts of therapy options or whatever. But from the perspective that I kind of come from and the stuff I've learned over the years, I mean, why is nutrition is it even being looked at in these kids that are, if there is even a real problem, nutrition is probably not even being looked at. And the fact that the schools that, like even the primary schools and the kindergartens, they've got Wi-Fi through them. I don't know if you've looked into this at all, but the non-native electromagnetic fields, there's an effect on the brain from those. And even the lighting, if the lighting has a lot of flicker, the artificial lighting, it's bad for the circadian rhythm. And I think there's even been a study I heard where they showed that the artificial blue light and a lack of windows in some classrooms increased the potential diagnosis of ADHD in those students, because they were more, obviously they're just messed up in the head because it's a totally unnatural environment. And it's like all these other factors just are not on the table, and then the drugs are the only thing to consider.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Robert Whitaker at Mad in America, award-winning reporter and author, he's wrote some great stuff on how this. We're told it's a chemical imbalance, and that's a whole nother hoax that's been brought forward that doesn't even exist. I think his book's the Anatomy of a Epidemic or something like that. Forgive me, Robert, if you're listening. But it's an amazing book on just what's going on. And, one of the chapters I have in my book's called Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. And I just ask parents to look in the mirror and say, is it really within your child? Is it really a brain dysfunction or some sort of mental abnormality that your child has, or is it just the fact that these things are going on? And as to how we agree to the diagnosis, if you want to be diagnosed ADHD, that's fine. When I wrote the book, my close friends who have known me for my whole life laughed. They're like, if anybody's ADHD, you are. I'm like, no, I'm an absent-minded professor. So we paint it either way, right? But in the book, I talk about the two things you should do is diet and structure, because what every problem child needs is structure. Every child who has challenges with social issues or academic issues, structure, right? These all are behavior modifications that have been shown to work time and time again, right? Diet. We've got so much sugar in our diet in the United States. I don't know about New Zealand where you're at, but it's just, I actually had a person a staff member at the university I worked at come up to me shortly after the book came out and said, so all three of my children are ADHD, and you think it's a hoax? That's ridiculous. And she's got what we call here a big gulp. It's like a 64-ounce Mountain Dew soda in her hand, right?
Yeah.
And I said, do your children drink soda? And she's like, yeah, of course they do. And I'm like, so how much soda do they have a day? And she's like, well, they have like one apiece at breakfast, and then they take one to lunch. And when they get home, they're only allowed to have two before dinner. And then they're only allowed to have one more pop at dinner. And then I make them stop drinking pop at 8. I'm like, so they're bouncing all around, and you think it's ADHD. If I had 3 Mountain Dews in one day, I'd probably die of a cardiac arrest. And yet we're not even looking at that. And for doctors, pediatricians to not say, let's first try working on the diet. Let's first try some structures. Let's look at Love and Logic as a parenting program that you might consider. Let's look at some different things that might help with your child to help them understand, what normal behavior, and I use air quotes, normal, should be. And for many of us, who aren't normal, we've never been normal. And thank God, our parents didn't medicate us into being zombies to fit into society. It's a practice that I just never thought I would see in a lifetime. I remember some childhood book I read where people that were amazingly strong and athletic, the government made them wear all these extra weights and do all these things that kept them from being super people. And I always reflect back on that book as to, what are we doing to these young boys? And one of the first chapter I wrote for that Debunking ADHD book is called Drugging Da Vinci. Because when you go online and Google famous people with ADHD, you get this whole list of all these amazing people. And my point to that is they're all from a different generation. And guess what? None of them were drugged for ADHD, So, yeah, if you want to call them ADHD, you want to call them gifted, you want to call them annoying, I don't care what you want to call them. My point is the last thing we need to do is drug them.
Yeah, totally agree. A few points I had from that. Like you're mentioning with the sugary drinks, in addition to that, there's also tons of toxic chemicals like additives and stuff as well. I mean, if it's just the white sugar alone, there's probably issues with that. But there's all the additives, and then there's the kind of polyunsaturated fatty, the vegetable oils. The canola oil, everything's being fried in, all that stuff. The buildup, it's not good, and that can contribute to tons of different health problems. You mentioned in there that was actually one of my questions for later on in the episode was going to be, when you see those lists, like you see those articles come out every once in a while, Da Vinci probably would have been diagnosed ADHD, or I think another one they do is Einstein, maybe Tesla, I can't remember.
Yeah.
What the heck does that even purport to mean? Because it's presupposing that it's a real condition, isn't it? which we're disagreeing on. So what does an article like that even actually mean?
Yeah, I'd laugh when I look at the list, because there's different parenting groups out there, and I've given hundreds of talks on this now, and there's always, when we're in the big cities and it's advertised, there's always a pharmaceutical group there to ask challenging questions and things. Funny enough, on Amazon, I haven't looked. I've quit looking at reviews. My mom always told me, if you're not making half the people mad with what you say, that you haven't said anything worth saying. If you're only saying stuff to make everybody happy, you're not really being honest. And she always thought I was probably too honest. But I put that book out, and the publisher hadn't even published it yet. The cover was done. They got Amazon stuff ready. It came up on the Amazon website, but wasn't available yet. And I started already getting reviews from people saying this book is horrible. Don't read it. This man doesn't know what he's talking about. And it was just, I just assumed, and the publisher and my colleagues and different folks at Psychology Today and Mad America, different place I wrote, we're just like, that's the pharmaceutical trolls out there going after you. So to some degree, there's billions of dollars being made, right? They don't want that to go away. And if evidence comes out that it's bad to actually give your children cocaine, then what's going to happen to that whole profit margin? And there's been plenty of studies that have shown what's wrong with pharmaceuticals. Way back when the Clinton administration offered to pharmaceutical companies, I think they got in a little trouble saying something about depression meds or something. But they offered, I think, like a half-year tax-free patent discount. So if you did a random trial study on these depression meds that you don't have to pay taxes on your sales here for half the year, right? So every company jumped on it, right? Every pharmaceutical company, a bunch of them did, and they're buried far in the FDA website still. But if you go and look, you'll find that not any of those studies found their drugs to be any more effective than a placebo drug for depression. And obviously, depression drugs lead to so many other things, such as suicidal ideation and needing another depression drugs, as the advertisements are telling us today. But none of them showed anything. And in fact, as we all know, depression goes away after, 40 weeks at the most. And if we can just get through it, therapy's great, right? But we don't need the drug. You got those studies. You got the NIMH funded 8-year study on ADHD drugs, where they found that basically after 8 years, the kids who got like a few hours of behavioral modification, all of them diagnosed ADHD. The kids who got a little bit of behavioral modification in a workshop, the kids that got nothing, all did better than the kids who got therapy and medication. And at the end of that 8 years, those folks that got the medication and therapy were doing the worst. And it was a random assignment. So there's one study after another that I found that just showed there's no great outcomes for these drugs. Recently, I lost one of my best friends a year and a half ago. He was on insomnia medication, and texted me on a Friday saying, Mikey, I kicked those drugs. I'm feeling great. And then on Sunday, I get a text from his family that he hung himself on Saturday night. So the fact that you have these withdrawal symptoms, the fact that you try to get off a depression medication and you can't even be around bright lights for 2 weeks without getting ill or falling down, the fact that, all these things lead to withdrawal symptoms show you that they're, as they should be, they're scheduled, dangerously scheduled narcotics that we shouldn't be playing around with. And I just think therapy is wonderful with the therapist. But what I don't understand, I know I'm getting off track, but what I don't understand is how the world of counselors and mental health and therapists have not realized it should not be your ethical obligation to also medicate during therapy, because there are no studies out there that truly show these drugs have led to better outcomes. If we look at the symptoms that we're using to diagnose, and we look at the medication guide that comes with these drugs and look at the side effects, there's no reason to take a drug whose side effects are that much more scarier and life-threatening than simple side effects that say, I'm annoying, right? Or I'm sad. It makes zero sense to me.
Yeah, totally agree. And no worries is going off on little tangents. That's a good thing. Like you mentioned, the trolling thing, that's quite extreme. I've seen and heard of things like that happening on social media in different places, but to have it happen to someone like you is a bit surprising, and also so blatant, before the book was even available to be doing that. That's quite funny and pathetic of them to be doing that. Because I think, theory only, I don't have any proof, but I do feel like there's the other side of the trolling where there's the negative trolling, which is to play down the work of yourself and probably other people. And then there's also bogus articles and bogus posts in different forums online, say Reddit, for example. It's like, oh, I'm so glad to be having these drugs. I'm so glad it's changed my life. I wonder how many of those are actually legitimate. I think it could probably be happening there as well.
But I can tell you one thing I didn't expect in writing the book was how many emails and phone calls even I would get from people basically all around the world, thanking me for writing it because their son or their daughter, OD'd or committed suicide or whatever after being on these drugs. And I got to meet a lot of them, and actually had a couple of the families travel around with us when we did talks on it throughout major metropolitan areas for a while in America. And it's sad. And I get a lot of, I don't read the hateful stuff, but when I get friendly stuff, a lot of the emails I get are from younger individuals, 20-something, that were put on medication, and they tell me how they hated the medication, they quit taking it, and either during high school and didn't tell their parents. Some will even say, I quit taking and started selling it for $20 a pill. But it's just, they tell me in so many correspondences that it just made me feel horrible, a zombie, ill, all these different things. And there's one lawsuit after another. One of the drugs, I forget the name of it, I've lost track of all of them, was making kids, actually young boys, were growing breasts and having to get breast reduction from being on the drug. It's just one study after another as to what's going on. The sad news is that the side effects of the drugs for ADHD connect to OCD. So you take one drug for ADHD as a kid, and what's going to happen is if you're taking that at a certain level, it's going to start having you display symptoms that make you a candidate for OCD diagnosis. And then they're going to give you that drug. So now you're on the ADHD drugs and the OCD drugs. You start looking at those combined side effects, and they're like, okay, now they're depressed because the side effects are depression. So now they get you on a depression drug as well. And for the really bad ones that happen, when you start looking at all the side effects for this whole series of side effects, symptoms, side effects, symptoms, side effects, then those last remaining ones relate to bipolar.
Okay.
And that's when we start seeing even more, lithium and all these really, really bad drugs that basically, keep you from moving out of your mom's basement for the rest of your life. So it's a pattern, and I wanted to write about it and talk about it to get it out there. Am I going to win against billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies? No. But if I can, help a few families make the decision as to, let's just buckle down and give it one more year of hard effort, structure, better diet, spending more quality time with our kids. reading some books on child development to be more aware of what to expect and what we can do, then that's worth it, At some point, it's probably going to be like the opioid addiction here in the USA. I don't know if it's hit over there, but the states have now won hundreds of $1 million lawsuits against opioid companies for prescribing these drugs that have led to a massive heroin addiction. And we've just, our EMR crews are just on the road every day reviving people from heroin overdoses because they got addicted to it from being prescribed opioids. So it's at some point we need to learn that here in America because we have the highest usage right now and highest diagnosis and medication use.
You mentioned, is that, I think, Purdue Pharma, I think that's one of the ones, is it, that's promoting that opioid?
There's a couple. I forget. I know in Ohio they just won a huge lawsuit against one of the big manufacturers.
Yeah. You mentioned that, going up against the pharmaceutical companies is difficult and all that. It's true, but I do definitely think that what you and the likes of Dr. Peter Breggin, and I'm sure there's others that hopefully I'll make an interview some of them as well. I think eventually chipping away at it, and once you reach critical mass, there will be change, like you mentioned, similar to how there has been with other toxic drugs. Maybe we could cover now the topic of what the drugs actually are, because there's different brands, and they might be, is it just branding or is the content slightly different? And then why they're dangerous, because I've heard that they are, you've mentioned, and Dr. Peter Briggin's also mentioned that they're similar to meth, cocaine in their form, but then you'll see probably sponsored articles saying, well, no, it's actually not similar to cocaine and meth. And so, is it a trivial difference, or what's the situation with that?
Yeah, Peter's got some great books on that, and that's as a psychiatrist with a medical degree, he's much better expert on it than me. But when you look at the chemical structure, they're darn near the exact same thing. Some want to call it pharmaceutical cocaine. But they're all trying to do the same approach, is that if we can I use this example. When I was like 14, I'm the youngest in my family, and one of my brothers had 2 kids, and I was to babysit them, and they were like maybe 4 and 5, and 2 of the most craziest children you've ever met. Just when they're younger, they're good kids now, but they would just run around like crazy. And someone in my neighborhood told me, feed them candy and they'll go to sleep quicker. So one night I went over there dreading having to babysit, and I just took a bunch of candy with me, and I fed them a bunch of sugar, and they ran around even faster for 1 hour, and by 9 o'clock they were asleep, right? Because they just completely OD'd on candy and sugar. And that's what happens, is if you're already, pumped up and you throw in a bunch more stuff, you're going to crash, right? So we are doing a controlled crashing of kids throughout the day to keep them at a level where they don't cause any disruptions, ask any questions, actually have any, thoughts for themselves beyond, boy, this pencil sure looks interesting. They're hyper focused all of a sudden on one word in a book. It's just not the idea. And I teach a lot of teachers, I teach a lot of therapists and counselors. And my point to them is, we've got to step up our game. We got to make classes exciting. We got to make learning fun and interesting. Because what I try to explain, it's not an attention problem. It's an interest problem. So you've got some of those drugs that are stimulants, right? Adderall, Vyvanse, different drugs like that. They come with massive amounts of side effects related to aggression and all types of different things. There's others that they just stumbled onto that were like blood pressure medicines that they figured out, oh, wait, this kind of helps reduce these symptoms associated with ADHD. So there's a whole slew out there. I really don't think any of them are good. I refuse to ever medicate anyone in my family. I've never even taken them myself, just because I'm afraid of them. I know some adults seem to enjoy them. I had a guy come over to my house one time to do some work, and he told me he was ADD and he was on Adderall, and he said it really helped him. But I think if you're an adult and your brain is actually developed and you're not taking these drugs before your prefrontal cortex has even thought about starting to solidify, I just think it's kind of silly to even consider it. But the drugs, if you look at all of them, none of them really have any studies that show it made an impact after 4 to 8 weeks. And those studies are typically, they say the symptoms were reduced, right? So any studies on the effectiveness of these drugs, no matter what they are, non-stimulant or stimulant, the only thing they can say is that the symptoms were reduced. So no longer was Billy wanting to get out of his seat. Billy sat there. No longer was Billy raising his hand. Billy sat there. No longer was Billy talking endlessly. Billy sat there quiet, right? So this is success of the drug. There's no research showing it improved academic performance unless not annoying the teacher as much led to a better grade. But it really never came to anything along those lines.
Yeah. And you mentioned in there that, teachers need to, engage better. There's that component of the interaction which is not getting looked at to the same degree. It's all looking at the receiving end. Are they receiving the teaching properly? Was the teaching that's going to them properly? And that's definitely, Dr. Peter Bregan's also talked about that as well. And I think it's to do with the fact that, I don't know how it is in the US. I'm sure you've got private and public schools, but in New Zealand, teachers are not paid that good on average. And so I think that, and not to say that the teachers are bad, but it's just for one, you really want to be attracting the best and brightest for teaching, just because that's creating the next generation for starters. And two, even the ones that are there that are great, they're under-resourced, underpaid, they're stressed, they're in a difficult position themselves, and so they become susceptible to this sort of propaganda from pharmaceutical companies or whoever, in what shape or form the propaganda comes to them, telling them, hey, you could make your job a lot easier if you push these drugs or contribute to the, coercing because it can happen in subtle and small ways in the parent-teacher interviews or whatever, to contribute to increasing the likelihood that Johnny gets on Adderall or whatever.
Yeah, to the teachers' defense here in America, they're underpaid and underappreciated. I taught in a juvenile detention center for a number of years myself, before I became a professor. But we have policy here, and it started with No Child Left Behind. Now it's Common Core, where it's really become how much stuff can we shove down these children's brains in a short time period so that they do better on the international PISA scores, PISA, Program of International Scholastic or some achievement. But it tests 15-year-olds. So here we're truly kind of obsessed with being the top education system in the country. And what's happened is there's just so many worksheets and so much stuff for them to get through in their curriculum book that they don't have time to make learning fun. They have to follow a certain pacing guide. They have to follow a certain curriculum. So the pressure is really on them, because if those test scores don't come up, they don't necessarily get to keep their job, which is a sad part. We colleagues of mine and me put together a book called The Handbook of Pro-Social Education about how education should be a two-sided coin, where one's about social life, because schools are social incubators, and also academic. And that's what a lot of my research for the governments looks at is, if we focus on developing character in kids and creating better school climates where kids want to be, what happens to achievement? So I think to just, give them a little support. I want them to know I care and I understand what they're up against. But I don't think a lot of them are pushing the drugs anymore. I think many of them have grown tired of it. I think the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s really wore some folks out. And I think younger teachers coming in, they see it as a calling, not a career. And they got into inspire people to wonderfulness. They watched all these fun movies we put out over here, School of Rock and, Mona Lisa Smile and all these different uplifting teacher movies. So I think they want to do it. I just think we have another problem here with IEPs, individual education plans, and 504s, where these are legal designations where we give a child a description and latitude for their behaviors. And unfortunately, like I said, there's some strange obligation where if we diagnose a child with a mental disorder, which should be a temporary thing, right? Just because you're depressed now doesn't mean you're going to be depressed for your whole entire life. But we give them a diagnosis of ADHD and suddenly it's a forever life condition, when in reality, it's a developmental delay. When we truly look at all the symptoms of ADHD at the different ages we diagnose kids, it's a developmental delay. When we look at Piaget, when we look at Vygotsky, when we look at all types of different theorists, that's all it is. So the sad part, that's what's going on in the schools. And I think we can do better. I just think teaching's a lot more fun when your kids are having fun, and I try to make my class fun, otherwise you can still keep it organized and structured. But kids get bored quick, these days. I think I'm probably much older than you, and I got bored when I was in school. You probably got bored when you were in school, and that's one of the other things is we've ignored brain research, right? Research on the brain that shows our attention span, right? Research on the brain in the first 10 years, basically they say, rule of hand, right? If you're 8 years old, you've got an attention span of 8 minutes. Okay. And here we have, in America, we have 7 periods of instruction, right? So yeah, you got 8 minutes of attention, then you need to take a break and refresh and get back to it. Well, we do 45 minutes of instruction in the first period, 45 minutes of instruction in the next period, 45 minutes of instruction, it goes on and on. And at, third period, the kid doesn't want to hear anything else the rest of the day. And then they get a whole 20 minutes of lunch where they got to be quiet and not talk to their friend. And it's just, honestly, I think that's what's destroyed. That is what's leading. I don't want to blame teachers. I think I would rather blame education policy at the national level here in the USA for what's going on with ADHD. Because you and I couldn't sit through 7 periods of high school today, or middle school, or elementary, without screaming and running out of school.
Yeah. I think with the teaching the school and how it should be set up, there's a lot of possibilities. And to me, broadly speaking, there either needs to be more of a libertarian approach where schools have freedom to try different things, and there can be a school over here, XYZ, doing this way of thing, and if the parents are on board with it, you can have that sort of approach. Or you can have the government running it and doing it really, really well, which would also be awesome. But and I'm not saying one's better than the other, but that discussion needs to happen, because when you look at the difference in teaching strategies and stuff between private schools and public schools, and in New Zealand we have these things called charter schools now. I can't really explain what they are, but there's so much variety, and I don't think enough of that variety is actually that exists potentially in the imagination of our minds and stuff that is actually being implemented. And especially in a country the size of the US, I always think this when I hear about American politics, because policy, it's all connected, that a country that big cannot run things well from one place, like DC, right? There needs to be way more decentralization for states or counties, whatever it is, to experiment. Otherwise, I don't know. That's just my take on it. I don't know what you think.
No, Finland's been number one year after year for the last 3 to 5 years, and they do local level, where, like you're saying, freedom to kind of create their own policy at local level. You have certain goals, right? We all want our kids to know how to read and write well and everything else, and be proficient in science and history, but there's a better way to teach it. I don't know about private or public or charter schools. We have them all here. My company evaluates schools all across the U.S. It's what we do, is look at schools and kids, and we work in child welfare as well, tracking foster children and CPS children and things, and monitoring them and trying to improve their well-being. But you'll find good and bad in every group there. I think I'd love to see us be more focused on trauma these days, because I think a lot of kids that are getting, like in our foster care sector right now, it's pretty normal to find a foster child, someone living in a foster home. Does that translate to New Zealand?
Yeah, we have that same
okay,
system.
I wasn't sure. But the, I'd say the average kids, at least 70% of them are on 3 to 12 drugs, because they've got behavior issues, right? And these behavior issues come across as symptoms of mental disorders, and suddenly we're drugging them to pay attention. We're drugging them to, not be angry or depressed, or we're drugging them to eat because the drugs make them not to eat, and then we're drugging them not to overeat, and then we're drugging them to go to bed, and then we're drugging them to wake up. Those are the ones I think we need to help, and that's one of the things with my special ed students. I have colleagues in psychology that are funded by pharmaceutical companies that don't want to agree with anything and not read past the cover of my book. And I've got colleagues in special ed that think I'm, gone off the deep end. But my point would be is, abnormal behavior, handicapped children, mentally handicapped as well as physically handicapped. We have such a large percentage of kids now with these IEPs and these 504s that we can't put in enough specialists to support all of them, right? And as a result, there's so many kids that, have serious issues with trauma or they're Down syndrome or they're autistic. And it's like, how do we really help those that have some, what I believe to be more serious and needs, right? Compared to a youth who just is tired of listening to Miss Baker talk about grammar. It's not the same,
Yeah. Now I think we should go into, because this one, there's an endless list of side effects, or not an endless, but there's a very, very long list, and we obviously won't be able to go through all of them. But I guess you could basically split it into mainly two categories, broader categories. Like there's the physical side effects, and then the mental brain, that sort of side effects. So the physical, you've got more like the stunted growth, like the growth hormone problem. Could you go into a little bit about that?
Yeah, microhemorrhaging is another one where it shows that your brain starts to bleed. They've done studies on mice with these drugs and showed that happened over and over again. There is a good amount of research that shows at least for a couple years of taking these stimulant drugs are going to lead to reduced growth. Some of them lead to higher blood pressure. Others lead to lower blood pressure. So then you got to get on blood pressure medicine. Another reason to go visit your doctor every month. You've got ones that cause aggression and anger. Most of them lead to depression. I'd say the vast majority of medication guides I've read related to ADHD medicines all have something saying it might have suicidal ideation. Heck, there's even some drugs that lead to young boys having extended periods of erections. It's just an endless list of ridiculous side effects that, no kid should be experiencing. It just goes on and on. I list most of them. What I urge people to do is, if you're questioning it, I ask them, go to the website. If you can't find the ADHD diagnosis online, go to my website, watch that video, the 7-minute diagnosis, and then also pull up the medication guide for the drug you're thinking about or the drug you're giving them, right? And look at those 18 symptoms and then look at the side effects of that drug. And you determine what would you rather take a chance on them. And what I try to urge people to do is read and realize that these symptoms of ADHD are all going to dissipate and go away year by year as your youth, as your child learns how to manage these things, right? And for some of us like me, it took me to be 25 to manage many of those things. But, I lived, I learned, and I directed my energies elsewhere once I finally figured out what I wanted to focus on. But, you meet kids that are ADHD and they're just so energetic, so full of energy. And then you see them after they take their medication. It's like, I don't know how we're doing it. And I know parents don't want to do it, or they didn't realize often they're doing something bad. They were told by a doctor, they're supposed to trust doctors, right? That this is the right thing to do. But it's not. And here in America, I don't know how your insurance works there, but in order for a therapist to bill an insurance company for therapy, they have to put down a code number as to what mental disorder this person has in order for insurance to pay. So when that kid comes in and they're the client, we have to put down a code number. They are ODD, or they're, ADHD, or they're this, or this, in order for us to bill to get paid for that therapy session. And I just think that's a whole nother problem, because how do you go that direction? And then the vast majority of therapists are going to prescribe these drugs. And I've never walked in any doctor's office where I saw the advertisements for ADHD, I saw the advertisements for the medications, and they don't have anything up there about the side effects. And we've only talked about 8. There's so many more. It's just
like what you're saying there with the insurance, the way that the system works there, that is definitely massively a sign of a broken system, because it has to work in a bad way for it to function. Is there any sort of, because this might be a bit difficult because it's more like about the chemicals component, but does the body accumulate anything from the drug, the amphetamine or whatever? Does it accumulate any sort of chemical, or does anything build up inside the body?
That's a hard one to determine. I don't know if they've figured that out yet, because obviously you'd have to figure out how to test that. It's kind of like the chemical deficiency, theory there, where basically it had to be a corpse that we'd have to pull things out of. So
true.
We have IRB and ethics here still, thank God. We're not able to do that. I did attack a Lancet medical article a while back. They did a study where they were trying to claim that ADHD kids have smaller brains. And I got emails from a couple editors telling me I had to tackle this because it can't be true. And when you looked at it, it was a very horribly designed study. It was done at like 10 different locations using 10 different scanners, set at 10 different levels of sensitivity. And it really didn't show the kids' brains were smaller. In fact, it showed positive findings for many of them, but they didn't list that in the writings. It was in the tables, but that you had to pay extra for to get from Lancet. That wasn't in the original publication. But what was interesting to me was that they didn't control for it. They said these were ADHD kids, right? But they didn't control for if those were ADHD kids that had taken drugs or not. Okay. So the question is, what do the drugs do to the brain? I'm curious if the drugs make the brain smaller and reduce, the growth of that.
True.
But we don't know that yet. And I love neuroscience. I love the scans. I love where they're going, but the sample sizes right now we're working with are just not big enough to truly, spread those findings over a whole population. You can't generalize a finding on a small sample of people to the whole population yet, and we're just not there. But the fact that they keep kids from sleeping, and we've got to give them sleeping meds, and sleeping meds are horrible, and it leads to this depression. It leads to OCD tendencies where they're obsessive compulsive. I mean, the symptoms just keep going on and on and on. And compared to being unorganized, talking too much, forgetful, uninterested in what's being talked about, I'd much rather have my child dealing with those simple issues than some of the symptoms we've listed.
Yeah. And I suppose in a similar sense, the next question I had would also be difficult to answer without those like more and more studies, which are going to be difficult to do, would be, do the drugs cause a predisposition for any sort of deficiencies? Like, does it, magnesium deficiency or potassium, or does it, that would also
I
be
don't think they've done anything. I haven't read anything like that. That's a really good question. I haven't read much on that yet.
The other one I had was, is there an increased likelihood of particular damage or failure or negative effect to some organs or other organs? Or
I think long term will show that. That'll be something we'll probably see in 20 to 30 years when folks start coming forward. But I to some degree, the studies they did on lab mice and different animals on these drugs, and I address a lot of those in the book, and Peter Bregan's done a great job looking up all those original studies. It's just insane to me what's happened to these lab rats. They just didn't behave normal after being on those drugs for that much. And they have a much shorter lifespan, so we're able to kind of theorize what's going to happen in the longer lifespan. But I think to your point is, what will happen from it, and we don't know. But we do know that, many kids have gone off of it. And I will say that I want to say this for sure. You never want to go cold turkey off a pharmaceutical drug. You want to go to your doctor and say, tell me a very safe way to titrate off of this drug, to wean ourselves off of this drug. And it might, cut it in half for the first month and quarter the second month, but you want to go down slow because depending on how long they've been on heavy dose, it can be dangerous going straight off that. There's been a number of, I know one family personally that they were on the front page of the New York Times because their son was addicted to Adderall and just couldn't get enough of it and ended up committing suicide. But you got to be careful getting off of it because obviously it's doing something to the brain. That dependency, the fact that the black box warning on all these drugs says it's highly addictive, right? At least in America, we make them do that and say it, but unfortunately, we're not reading it anymore or something because it's like, okay, it's highly addictive. Why would I give this to an 8-year-old? So. I think if you could cross that over to, drug addiction studies, you've got a comparative line of research you could consider looking at.
Yeah. And with another one I've heard is that it prevents the natural personality of the child from developing. Like they end up potentially not knowing their true self. Is that because you're born obviously with, there's the genetics and you get from your parents, and that puts you on a certain trajectory. I mean, obviously there's environmental, cultural, location and influences, but with the drugs it kind of alters that permanently. Is that something you found?
So I have a great friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Foltz in Chicago. He's a professor and therapist there, and I've presented with him a lot. And he's found some really interesting research on epigenetics and how some of these drugs are actually slowly changing genetic code in those. And I'm not specific as to if it's certain ADHD meds, but in general, pharmaceuticals can have that impact. But I try to, with my college students, when I'm explaining to them, I ask them to, think back to their freshman year and the most stoned drunk roommate or someone on their dorm floor that they knew. And I asked them, did those people make good decisions on a daily basis? Right. And what's everybody's answer?
No.
And it's like, here we are giving some of the hardest drugs to children to make good decisions on. Right. And the most important days and years of their life where they've got to learn that decision making, right? The prefrontal cortex is where we make that decision, and it's not solidified to our mid 20s or so, or matured, if we want to put in those terms. But if we're not helping them create those neuron pathways to making better decisions, then I would say yes. Your question is, yeah, it's causing harm because, think about how many brain cells those drugs are killing. We don't want them doing drugs, but we're okay giving them pharmaceutical drugs. You don't think the pharmaceutical drugs are killing just as many brain cells as a legal drug or beer or alcohol or whatever? It's still going to have that. And there is a lot of wiring going on. And to some degree, I'm afraid, our brains come hardwired to some degree. And I'm afraid we start drugging these kids even younger. It might be messing with their hardwiring. From the beginning. I wrote an article for Psychology Today. I was malarkey or something, or I said it was mind boggling. I named it after a Will Ferrell movie. But the study, someone sent me a data file that I verified, and I come to find out that here in America, we are actually medicating like over 350,000 infants and toddlers for anxiety and bipolar. And I couldn't believe it when I first got it. And I investigated and wrote this article on it because I'm like, if you've never been around a baby before, an infant, their mood can change in 1 second, from happy to sad to screaming to laughing to smiling to giggling. And it's like, we're going to define that as bipolar now. And think about that. If you want to talk about brain damage, I just can't imagine the first 3 years of having an infant and a toddler on something as Xanax or anything along those lines. It's just unheard of. And there's been some lawsuits that have came from that. I don't know if it's slowed down at all, but
Yeah, I can't really understand how. I mean, I assume some of the people promoting and facilitating the spread of that stuff are probably sincere, but misinformed, ignorant, haven't bothered to look into the opposing viewpoints. But I'm sure there's people that know exactly what's going on. I can't understand how they can live with themselves, prioritizing their next Mercedes or whatever it is that they're using the money they make on this from.
One of the professors was at one of the Ivy League schools, remained unnamed, but he had taken over $1.2 million from, I think, 6 different pharmaceutical companies, and the university didn't know about it. And he was out doing all this research showing, yeah, this stuff's real. And the university thought he was doing great research and finding the stuff, and lo and behold, guess what? He was being paid a lot of money to say he found something.
Yeah. It's not good. And you're talking about the Dr. Robert Feltson.
Robert Foltz, yeah.
Foltz, yeah. I'm gonna look that up afterwards. But yeah, I definitely believe that his idea that there's the potential for genetic, or maybe he's even proven it already, that subtle genetic damage from the stuff. I mean, you consider how fragile that stuff is, and that we know it's being affected by phones in pockets affecting men's sperm count, motility, and things like that. I mean, it makes total sense, especially when this thing's actually being ingested, right? It's going straight into the body, that there would be an effect.
But the brain develops from having things stimulate you, right? Sensory. And how well is the brain going to develop if our mind is not allowing us to take in all the sensory? There's going to be a delay in that. And as to being able to make the right decision, it's that's the thing, is how do they really learn to make the right decision, and how much longer does that take when you're drugging them, and where they should be learning it earlier? But I don't think it's going to help kids learn what they need to learn if they're medicated to that level.
And on the topic of the growth suppression of growth, I've heard can't remember who I heard saying it, but they were saying how you can actually test for growth hormone in the child, and that is supposed to be taking the ADHD drugs. And if growth hormone is normal, then that is used as a sign, an indicator that they're spitting it out or not actually taking it, like that. It's that sure of the effect of taking it, suppressing growth hormone. Is that
I haven't read about
correct?
that.
I think it was Reagan that said that in one of the YouTube videos I watched. But
yeah, I have a friend who he was the middle boy, and they put him on Ritalin back in the day, and he's like 5'6", and the others are like 6'1", and he feels very angry about, we became friends later on, and then he was reading my stuff. He's like, so my parents did this, right? and I'm like, I don't know, buddy, maybe, who knows? But yeah, it's gonna do something. I mean, what do you blame it on? I guess, siblings often look at different ways. We don't know how tall everybody's going to be, right? It's kind of a guessing science. It's a modeling, but to some degree, you got to wonder when you average it out how it works. But when you see families like that, and you might have seen that, but it is strange when you find out the one youth in the family that was on ADHD drugs is that much shorter than everybody else.
Yeah, and also, there's obviously different potential causes, and it's hard to say exactly. But when that guy was the middle child, because there's a thing where I think the mother usually has slightly less minerals and of some types of minerals to depend on the future, on the second, third, fourth, just unless their diet and health and everything they're doing is like super perfect, which in most cases it's not, then that inevitably happens. So that could also be a potential explanation for it. But like in cases when it's the firstborn, but I'm sure they've already done the averaging out of statistics to show that, because that's one of the ones that they'll even admit on their websites, the RX list or RX something. It's like top of the things, like potential side effects.
Yeah,
may cause suppression of growth, and weight gain as well.
Yeah. They thought for a while it was actually causing kids to lose weight, and they do it sometimes. They monitor the weight, but over time it actually leads to obesity. So it's not good. But I mean, when you think about it, we're medicating them to not want to get up and do much. When my son drives me nuts and he's bouncing off the walls after school, I said, you got a bicycle, go out and ride it. I want 20 laps. Go out and run through the field. I want 10 laps, or I'll just go out and run with them. I'm like, let's do sprints. I can still beat you. That's what I urge folks to do. I know, and you seem to be real natural focused. There's some great research on a nature deficit and what goes on, and just think about, and I love that research because how often do kids go out and walk in the woods any longer, or get fresh air, or do these things? I mean, there's so much more you can do with your child. The problem is our lifestyles keep us from, doing what our parents did before, or, I mean, I guess my parents didn't do a lot, but back then you could put the kids out in the front yard and not worry about them, and let kids run around. In America, we're a little worried to do that, but I just think they have to get outside. And in our elementary school, they get like 2 recesses a day, like 20 minutes twice a day. They get to middle school, which is what we call like 6th, 7th, 8th grade, right? And they get no recess. And I think they get 9 weeks of gym during those 3 years. So here, it's all focus on curriculum, and we're ignoring all research on the brain that shows us we're only going to take in so much. We're only going to retain even less. And here we are trying to fit more and more and more in, and more is not better in this situation.
Yeah, I totally agree. The nature deficit disorder, and I think you're talking about the phasing out of teachers being involved with the ADHD, and that's sort of happening less and less and less, and that's a good thing. I think the next problem that is going to arise, which is already underway, is the bringing in tech into school, because e-learning is obviously superior to normal learning, obviously, because we didn't need to actually prove it, but it's obviously better, right? And which it's not, if you can't get my satire, but because the artificial blue light, they're just the craning of the neck, there's Wi-Fi boosters everywhere. That area, I mean, they're even further behind on research on that compared to the negative effects of ADHD. But that's gonna come up soon, and that compounds the lack of nature, because it's the opposite of nature. It's unnatural sounds, unnatural light, unnatural frequencies bombarding these fragile bodies, and I think.
Yeah, but to that point though, too, I agree with you. But what's funny is you can have a kid that shows zero interest in school, right? Doesn't want to learn anything, doesn't want to read anything, and you give them a tablet or a laptop and you say, read this or do this, and they will spend 4 hours on that thing, right? So once again, it's not about the attention deficit, right? It's about motivation and interest, and they're interested in that. So, I mean, give them blue light glasses. I don't know, figure out a better filter. But schools here, we're getting some pretty good tech in our schools. Nearly everything is online now with testing. We have some schools are doing some great work with flipping the classroom, where the kids basically, watch these videos and learn it online, and then they come into the classroom and actually do activities and different things. It's a little better approach, and I think they learn. A lot of kids learn better. They kind of like the electronic side of it. But I'm with you. I just got done putting a proposal together, worked on it for like a month, and handed it in last Friday. And I was trying to review it online. I couldn't review it anymore, so I printed out the 150 pages on paper just so I could sit outside and read it and edit. I just couldn't look at the screen any longer. So.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things they can do to make it healthy, like just make it wired tech rather than wireless, because then there's just a small electric and magnetic field rather than but obviously the tech companies, they don't want to do that, because they can sell more Wi-Fi routers that make them more profit. So that's an issue there. And then with the blue light filters, that is definitely an option. You can get them to attach to the screen or wear glasses, but then it might reduce the stimulation that they're getting out of it, because there's some studies on the artificial blue light being addictive, which might be why they get into it. You were mentioning someone who was previously not interested might get interested in it. So it's a complicated topic. What's the best way to use this stuff positively going forward? Another random question I had here, which is a little bit different, is what's your view on the ADHD positivity crowd? That's just a term I've created. They probably wouldn't identify with that, but these people because I think you've got the first level of sort of brainwashing, which is like you have something inherently wrong with you for life because of these 18 things that we've managed to tick off the checklist. Here's the drug. And then the next step, when people kind of break through that conditioning, is that, okay, I'm it's not a bad thing. I can actually feel good about it because whatever. But then they're accepting the premise that it is still something legitimate. They're accepting the narrative that they do have this condition. So what's your thoughts on that? Because the problem with that is that keeps the drug thing going. It keeps the drug thing going. It's just a positive spin on it. That's my take on it. But
yeah. Well, I think with any disorder that you're labeled or identified with, to some degree, it's like it's a gift, right? You've been wondering, why am I different? What's wrong with me, right? And then someone, a doctor, a specialist, a therapist tells you, you have so-and-so, and it's like, oh, okay, that's what it is, right? So I can understand how that feels and that identity that comes from knowing that now, and it's okay to be that. So I understand the nature of that approach. The thing I try to do is say you could still have that, but if it's ADHD, I would just like to call you gifted. I would just like to call you amazing, And by the way, we don't need to drug people that are gifted and amazing, I use Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory for example, he's got 8 different types of intelligences to look at, and a lot of them connect to ADHD symptoms. That you're an intrapersonal genius. You communicate with yourself much better, and you're doing this and that. You're an interpersonal genius. You communicate with others great. It's weird to me. And when you look at, why can't we just call them extroverts? What's wrong? No one wants to be called an extrovert anymore because we're labeled horrible people, by the introverts of the world. But I mean, to some degree, ADHD just reflects a very highly extroverted approach, right? It also, in some degrees, reflects a very highly introverted approach. So these extreme personality traits we might have just make us unique. And to those folks, I hear from them all the time. I am ADHD and I'm okay with it, and these drugs are great. And I'm like, well, good luck. But I want you to know, you are smart, you are wonderful, and believe it or not, you don't need the drugs. And I mean, like I said, people call me ADHD all the time. I don't care. I can't sit in one place. I can't go to a conference and listen to stupid people talk forever. I'd rather go out and, grab a good meal and read something myself rather than hear someone talk about it. But I can't sit still. I get cabin fever. So many things I couldn't do as a kid, I still can't do as a human being. But when did it become required that we all, sat in the same, church at the same pew and got up and knelt at the same time and did the same thing for our whole entire life, right? It just seems unfair to me. And I just think kids should have a chance to live an amazing childhood and dream about stuff and daydream about things in school and run around and scream and have a good time every now and then. But we're not letting them do that. I don't know about there, but you've got 7-8 hours a day where you've got to sit there and be quiet and study and do whatever. And when they get home, I'm sure they're going to drive a lot of parents crazy, because that's a lot of energy that couldn't be let out.
Yeah, for sure. Too much sitting potentially is maybe part of it. So what would I like what you're saying there about the what I call the ADHD positivity crowd, and switching it from, you can have a term to identify and group yourself in, but call it gifted rather than ADHD. I think that's a logical switch that I think is good. Let's say some parents are about to start getting their kid on, or they have been and they're thinking of changing, or there's a person who's a late teens or adult, and they're someone who's wanting to change the way their whole take on this issue. What does a non-drug approach look like? What could they do? I mean, I'm sure there's a huge variety of, and just from different countries and what's available, but what's something you could not recommend but share on how what a non-drug approach could look like?
Well, I think diet is essential, as you mentioned earlier. I think exercise every day is important, and whether that's just walking outside and talking and having some, quality time with parents and kids, get out and do it together. I think if you're worried about the after school time, set up a structured schedule. When they come home, they're going to take 10 minutes to relax, get a snack, and then they're going to sit down and do their homework for 30 minutes. And after that, they're allowed to do this, and this for an hour. And then we're going to have dinner, and then we're going to spend some time together. But too many, I think, are letting them come home and just get on the screen for, 4 hours or 10 hours or whatever. I also highly recommend making bedtime 9 o'clock. There's no reason for younger kids to be up past 8 or 9 o'clock. They need 12 hours of sleep, and they're not getting enough when we let them go to bed at 11 and they got to get up and go to school at 6. So that's the structure I'm talking about. The other thing I recommend often is that they go to the school, and when they first if they're on the meds, they go to the doctor and said, we need to wean off these meds. and they start doing that. But I would go to the school and talk to the teachers, and I would talk to the principal if that's needed. And I would explain to them, here's what we want to do, and here's what we're trying to do with our son or daughter, and we'd really like your help. Here's what we're trying at home, and we'd like to stay in close communication with you. And if you could just do this, this is what they're really wanting. Most teachers love hearing from parents that want to be more involved. They all know it's the secret to academics being better when parents are involved. So my point is, get more involved, structure, diet, exercise, just make it better for the whole family. For parents, that means you got to figure out how to turn your day off at, 6:30 and really spend some time with the kids for a while. Because, life gets too consuming. And a lot of these folks I meet don't come from homes where the parent's at home and has time to spend a lot of time with them. A lot of them are very busy families or single parent families where, mom's trying to do everything and can't do it all.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about speaks to the whole interrelatedness of different problems in society in terms of the economic problems, because that's what creates the fact that two parents need to work, the economic problems in a society. Whereas we're starting to, I think, being quote unquote accepting that as normal, but I don't think and whether it's the mum or the dad, doesn't matter, but it was not normal always. It was normal for there to be one parent, for that level of abundance where one job, was able to make ends meet, and the economic problems have made that way, way worse and way, way harder. And so that also feeds into how these diagnoses even happen in the first place, because people are just at their wits' end, tired, can't keep track of it, and say, okay, well, I need a quick solution to this complicated problem, and the drug is that quick solution. So I think, like you're saying, after school, having a parent at home, and that's not an easy solution. That's not going to be an easy solution at all. And I hope that does change. But another thing with the sleep, that's so true. I've read that there was a school, they did a test somewhere where they actually started the day later. They didn't fix the bedtime, but they fixed the start of school, made it later, and there was a better performance, better behavior, et cetera, because they got to sleep in. And it's so true. We need proper sleep, especially in the further north it is, because the sun hasn't come up, right? And so you need, or south, you need to be getting up, adults we can do it, but not consistently for a young child before the sun's even up. That's not really.
It's painful.
Yeah, ideal. And like you said, your family time that in the evening and stuff, and people are always glued to devices. Netflix is the new sort of TV, and I think that
Minecraft,
plays into
the game, eating up every young child in the world.
Yeah, it's those things which are all peripheral. They are all playing into this.
I'm not a big fan of video games. I mean, I've played my own Doom addiction, in the past when I was in my 20s. But some of the stuff we're letting kids play related to, shooting games and killing games and different things. You talk about decision making. It's not healthy. And beyond a half hour of that, every day or so, I can't imagine it being healthy. But there are some folks that are allowing that to play, and then they're wondering why a kid behaves that way. Well, what they're exposed to is what they're going to put in their brains. And a lot of what I'm talking about on this routines is modeling. And that's how we learn. That's how we've learned from our parents in the past for generations and decades, right? Is our parent acts a certain way and we try to act that way as well, or our parent acts a certain way and we hope to never act that way ever. Whatever the modeling may be, that's what we need to look at. But sometimes in order to get kids to exercise and eat well, we have to do it too.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't believe in the TVs in the bedrooms and the computers in the bedrooms are a bad idea for anyone, young or older. And going to bed and reading. I mean, at my kids' school, it's a very affluent school district, and they require reading every night, 30 minutes at least every night. So if parents could turn off the TVs and go to bed and read, and the kids are going to bed and reading, these are things that are going to help a child sleep better. Allowing them to have that screen time all the way up to the time they go to the bed, even if they do fall asleep, it's horrible quality. And we know that.
Yeah. I had access to a phone when I was younger, but I'm glad that just for whatever reason I was obsessed with reading, and I'm so glad that was a hobby I had, especially before sleep, because it's getting away from those stimulations, the frequencies, the light. And you mentioned there that the gaming, and I agree with you that especially with RPGs, the role playing games, you end up with people who devote so much time into this being a hero inside 0 and 1s on a disc and on a screen. They're in pixels. They're a hero in pixels land, but they're not being the hero of, like trying to do their best back in the real world. And it's like a way of escape. It's escapism. It's a form of experiential avoidance that they're doing.
I think that these new generations are thinking that way. I actually have an intercultural experience. I offered a lot of my classes as extra credit, where they go out and meet someone from someplace else, a different religion, do something that they've never done before that would expand their, understanding. And I actually had a student a few years ago email me and ask, well, can I write about the person I met on World of Warcraft? And I'm like, no, for God's sakes,
Yeah, that's pretty hilarious, in a sad way. But what is the current status in academia? Who else is raising the alarm bells? I mean, you don't have to name them, but like, is the projection positive or neutral or negative?
I don't know. It's just depends on where you're at. The major universities, which I've taught at, have the research ones. Most of their psychology programs and psychiatry programs are funded by pharmaceutical companies, even their medical programs. So for anybody to speak out there against something like that means losing funding. It becomes major politics. You hire a guy like me to come in, it becomes major politics. I think the most outspoken folks are coming from research 2 schools, where you got a little bit more latitude at a smaller state school or a private school. But I don't know if they're focused on it. I think too many people are focused on testing here related to schools and not really focusing on what we're doing to kids. Our news here, you don't get on the news unless it's about politics in America, or a tragedy happened. So a lot of it gets buried. There's some great work coming out of the New York Times year after year related to this and exposing it. But our newspaper world has died here for the most part. We have Wall Street Journal, a few local papers, New York Times, big, local but national, USA Today. There's only a couple, and their USA Today is pretty thin. So it's really become more internet based on how you can get it out, which that's a challenge because you're one voice, right? You have podcasts, you have websites or whatever, and you're going against a company that made, $300 billion last year, who's got a whole building fighting against you. It's kind of difficult. So I don't see much changing until we change the way we view insurance, and that's a major part of the debate right now in our president politics right now, how we approach it. But we want to figure out how to save money and not have insurance cost so much and medical cost so much, but where there's plenty of research that shows that if you're on medications for mental health, you're going to be treated for years longer than you would if you weren't on medication. And I think if insurance companies could start realizing that, then we might actually be able to make some progress, because I don't think they want to pay more money than they have to, right? And we've started sharing information about that, and I think some are starting to see the light, but somehow this pharmaceutical and insurance thing's still connected. This diagnostic code and insurance is still connected. I think if we could somehow break that cycle, if insurance companies finally say we're not paying for all that because it's not needed and it's not helping and it's actually costing us more money, then doctors might finally get away from it.
Making some financial incentives to not do it.
I think this opioid thing might be a wake-up call, because when states start being able to sue pharmaceutical companies for hundreds of millions of billions of dollars, maybe they'll stop putting out stuff like that. So I think it's going to take a systemic change, and not just a couple academicians like myself pointing out the facts and trying to get a few people to listen.
And also, I guess the structuring around how, maybe this would be government regulation, I don't know, in terms of how long drugs are tested for. Like, I understand that from what I understand, the ADHD meds are very, very short-term testing, like only in the weeks.
Yeah, they're like 4-week, 8-week tests. So
it's not really good enough. Anyway, I think it's time to wrap up. Where could people find your work if they want to support your work? Maybe, what sort of, because you have a company and you're also teaching and you've got the YouTube channel as well and the book.
Yeah, I have so Debunking ADHD's YouTube channel. I'm on Facebook, Debunking ADHD. I haven't done a lot. I'll be honest, I've been working on the child welfare world quite a bit. My solution's called vitalchild.solutions. So we have a lot there. I'm at Marshall University, and if you know my last name, Corrigan, you can probably email me. I was the first one there. So you can reach out, but I'm always more than willing to try to help when I can. But yeah, pick up my book. It's on Amazon as well, or however you want to get it. And if you ever want me to come to New Zealand to do something, let me know, because I'm a fly fishing fanatic and I've always wanted to get there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I have a friend who's real into that. Well, all right. This has been really good, Michael. Thanks for appearing on the show.
Thank you. Have a great day and keep up the good work.
Well, there you go. That was Dr. Michael Corrigan. I really enjoyed talking to him. I'm sure all of you got a lot of value out of that as well. I'd actually like to interview more people like Michael on this topic of ADHD, this epidemic that's in society. So, if you know someone who would be a good person for me to interview, a potential guest on the podcast, or you yourself think you could help cover this topic from a slightly different angle, then please get in touch. My email is growsanctuary, no spaces, growsanctuary @gmail.com, and we can maybe organize something. I'd also just like to mention, do share this far and wide, obviously, because we want to get this information to as many people as possible. And lastly, if you would like to see more of my work, more of my content, it's available on Instagram at Grow Sanctuary, YouTube, Grow Sanctuary, BitChute, Grow Sanctuary, and the website growsanctuary.com. And this podcast is available at this point in time on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So, with that, I'll end this, and I hope all of you have a great week. Thank you for listening.